Mudfossil University is a YouTube channel that has eternally fascinated me. This well-spoken, seemingly bright gentleman spends multi-hour-long streams looking at Google Street View, Google Earth, hoping to spot things, particular things, strange things that stand out to him. Let me show you one.
This is probably came from this creature, so it's not that this was here and he's laid on top of it. I don't think. But this is more where it's sort of decaying. But it's not much decay. There's his throat right here. It's only right there. It's just, I mean, you're talking almost nothing. And that is the color of blood. I've sure everybody that does the mud fossils understands that's what happens when blood leaches from something. And you can see it's draining out here all over. See? That could go all the way down there. I have no clue. But I think I've shown enough here to make a strong case for the fact that this is a dragon, and virtually everything they said about him is true.
It's a thing that seems easy to laugh at, I'm sure. It's clearly absurd, right? The world was not and has never been populated with dragons. The idea they were the size of entire countries or continents is a bit of a leap. He's an extreme form of something, though, that is far more common. This is the Devil's Tower in Wyoming. It's amazing to see in person. It's the result of very unique ecological, geological, cosmological, and all the other types of things that we can't even imagine coming together in one unique moment. Well, one unique moment on a cosmic scale. But to him, he says it's a tree stump, proof of gigantic, massive trees. Well, you laugh. Part of you gets it. It seems like it is. It's not hard to look past this complex and almost unknowable set of circumstances and forces and take the seems like as its own thing. The way it's organized just seems like a tree stump. Here is a moment. In front of you, this moment is a unique combination of genetic, social, political, economic, cosmological, and so many other things we can't imagine coming together in this moment. A moment on the cosmic scale. And I say, I wanted to make this video. You say you wanted to watch it. I mean, it seemed like you wanted to, right? It's not hard to look past the overtly complex and almost unknowable set of circumstances and forces and take the seems like as its own thing. The way these surfaces exist, it just seems like a want. But it's not a want. Just as there are no gigantic tree stumps of that scale. Instead, the want, it's the end of the process. The result of forces entering into the world and the image they leave behind. The real forces, well, that's desire. Desire's a word we use a lot, even in modern day. Someone who's planning a shopping center probably will talk about desire pathways of customers. User experience designers building some app for some company talk about seductive design that pulls at a user's desires. Desire's one of those things built into so many disciplines and spoken about so very often that we forget that its complex forces are at work and that it's interplaying with so many factors. And here, something actually pretty rare for this channel, the term that is used by those ad agencies, architecture groups, UX gurus, game designers, marketing people, Lacan, Zizek, Deleuze, Guattari, they're actually all talking about the same thing. And it's not giant tree stumps. First, the good news. You're in good company with your giant tree stump. ContraPoint's last video on Twilight did just that, spending a huge amount of time conflating desire with want. And this video was born of a particular frustration. You see, at one point, she references a Seinfeld episode, The Keys, it's the end of season 3, It's a perfect episode, actually, to break down the functioning of desire and repression, but she ended up only using it to solidify this gigantic tree stump of psychoanalysis that is wants. But to break down that episode of Seinfeld, we're going to need to speedrun the entire history, maybe, of desire, because it's really not just a simple bit of pedantry. It's actually a really, really complicated bit of pedantry. So with that, I'm going to give my caveats, as I always do. This is not an exhaustive video. It is not total, and it is not everything. I am here to oversimplify things. That's how this works. So watch for names I mention. Go read them if you think it's interesting, because every single one of them, even the ones I seem to hate, are interesting. So as we go back in time, we're going to stop here, because this is, for me, really where our modern conception of desire begins. So bear with me, this really isn't simple. Hume was a thinker in the 1700s who put forward the idea that reason is not really the best basis for us to consider ourselves in the world. See, if we inch back slightly, we hit this Enlightenment period, a period lauded for teaching us how amazing the rational mind is, how reason is man's highest faculty, and with that we can control ourselves and each other socially. Apparently, this was a big step for us in the West. Or not. Kids, read your history books. There's a lot of other things. But for us, we can use our faculties to understand the world through rational thought. Hume thought this rational thought thing was a bit of a silly oversimplification of how the human mind and human experience really works. Now, he's not the first. Of course, it's shout outs to Spinoza, if I want to go back a bit. But Hume did write some bangers, like, reason is and ought to be a slave to the passions. See, for Hume, things happen to you, and that moment of impact leaves an impression somewhere deep in you, on your soul, as he put it. Either the impression is felt bodily, like burning your hand on a hot pan handle, or it's an impression felt reflectively, as you realize the pan was supposed to be covered in a silicone handle and is broken in some way. 'Tis certain that the mind in its perceptions must begin somewhere, that since the impressions precede their correspondent ideas, there must be some impressions which, without any introduction, make their appearance in the soul. As these depend upon natural and physical causes, the examination of them would lead me too far from my present subject into the sciences of anatomy and natural philosophy. Bodily pains and pleasures are the source of many passions, both when felt and considered by the mind, but arise originally in the soul or in the body, whichever you please to call it, without any preceding thought or perception. A fit of the gout produces a long train of passions, as grief, hope, fear, but it is not derived immediately from any affection or idea. It's this second type of moment that yields passions, what I see as coming to be understood as desire. Hume figured out why people make giant tree stumps. It's because the passions, well, they're not really a thing we can rationally describe or talk about. At best, they're vibes that we can gesture at. Maybe. Poets are good at it, as he says. These passions come together and they become reasons. We build reasons out of them from what we can assign meaning to in one way or another reflectively. Thus, a man who, by any injury from another, is very much discomposed and ruffled in his temper, is apt to find 100 subjects of discontent, impatience, fear, and other uneasy passions, especially if he can discover these subjects in or near the person who was the cause of his first passion. Those principles which forward the transition of ideas here concur with those which operate on the passions, and both uniting in one action, bestow on the mind a double impulse. This new passion, therefore, must arise with so much greater violence, and the transition to it must be rendered so much more easy and natural. This interaction Hume lays out here stands in stark contrast to this idea of a perfect reason, a magical faculty that is its own start and ending, fully self-contained, unimpacted by the world, yet wholly impacting the world as it acts. Reason, rational thought, singular mind, this thing, this totalizing thing, it is a gigantic tree stump, created to ignore the multitude of complexity underneath. Hume made major impacts on the world. It wouldn't be long for one avid reader of Hume who would write the following notes. As some impressions from Hume become conscious, so may some ideas, i.e. habits, which must require idea to order muscles to do the actions. I suspect the endless round of doubts and skepticism might be solved by considering the origin of reason as gradually developed. The man who wrote this, Charles Darwin, began by studying geology and collecting fossils. He actually spent most of his time studying really unique geological formations and giving ideas on how they came to be. Eventually, he noticed something peculiar. Animals existed in areas that seemed to suit them. Polar bears were up north, barnacles in the sea, field mice in the field, finches on various islands. He realized the conditions of existence for these animals applied complex pressures on their growth and living and dying. Darwin would propose a theory, evolution, the idea of, at first, natural selection, which later morphed into sexual selection. This change wasn't small, and it certainly wasn't meaningless to him. Selection is less a neutral process, and instead an affirming one, where creatures sexually select partners for reproduction. Really, the only reason we now say natural selection instead of sexual is because the intellectual Puritans of evolution are prudish and old. Thank God time passes. The massively complex interactions of forces that produce the world, it's simply not singular. It's just not. Even me saying sexual selection as a driving force is really uncharitable to Darwin, as Darwin himself regretted his use of a personified nature as a singular thing, which he actually called the aggregate actions and product of many laws, and by laws only the ascertained sequence of events. A hell of a deep way to put it. See, those forces at play, the ones we can only understand as we look at a particular set of events, these forces themselves are incredibly complex. They're incredibly unknowable, and there are so many of them. Another thinker would be inspired to chase these down, and he would chase down the forces directly. See, to Nietzsche, these forces, well, they're desperate, but one had one thing that united all of them. They were all moving to overcome. See, it's not simply survival. Survival's the image of the thing, the result of overcoming adversity. Nietzsche's will to power was a bit about this and about this force, a force that overcomes resistance, overcomes repression, a force to overcome, a countervailing force to entropy. You might say the force of life itself. Now, for Nietzsche, the will to power was an internal self-mastery, the will, that could recognize the complexities of that force, power, utilize it to overcome resistance through intellectual processes. Of course, it's not difficult to see how one might take all this, even after all the explication of how the complexity shouldn't be oversimplified or personified, as a claim that these forces are actually directed at whole objects. That would be easy to believe if you really, really wanted to. You just condense it a bit. Think of it as a YouTube version of all this, of that. The will to power seems to be about controlling and properly using instinctive forces. Sexual instinct seems to be aiming at pleasure itself. You are maybe the product of these as one moves through the other. The it, or as we in the West like to say, the id, this thing that produces only pleasure and wants pleasure, this pure instinct. And the superego, the libidinal energy coming from one, shaped by the other. Out comes the ego. Because of this, your wants for pleasure are mediated by the world and surface into it through you. Thanks to Freud and the countless ways he impacted our culture, people are quite happy to talk about wants and wishes conflated with the complex forces all underneath all of it. So where's the tree stump here? Did you notice it? You should have. I mean, it's you. More specifically, the tree stump is this idea of you. Everyone else here so far that I've brought up was trying to dig deeper towards this multitude of things happening, this complexity, the processes that sort of work together, to emergently work together, that produce us, the world we're in, all of this, but not Freud. He started and presumed this whole person, and he worked backwards from there. This means all of those forces, well, they must be your wants. All that complexity is now personified, made yours, singular. Lucky for us, lots of things translate poorly. Freud did much of this when he wrote the word Wunsch. In English, this is just wish or want, but in French, it's been translated specifically as desire. Want and wish and Wunsch, these are individualized in English and German. They're yours. I want something. I wish for something. It's singular. But in French, désir more matches desires or passions, and it emphasizes specifically this complex plurality. The guy who did this, well, his name's Jacques Lacan. Sometimes you might even spot him in the wild dressed as a homeless drifter named Slavoj Žižek. I'm not going to pretend I'm going to come close to giving a synopsis of anything Lacan said. He simply was brilliant, but difficult. Story I like to say about how difficult he was is one time, after answering at length a question posed by Jacqueline Miller, who's also a brilliant student of his, Lacan turned to him and finished saying, I hope that sheds light on it. And Miller apparently responded, it sheds some light and some shadow too. That's probably the best way I've ever heard anyone describe reading Lacan. But anyway, for Lacan, the idea that this organized person exists before they say anything, it flies in the face of everything that we've come to understand about all of it, but especially language. You see, every word has a stunningly large set of connotations, meanings, and concepts that sit behind them. There's this complexity of interactions that, once again, are being simplified, flattened, forgotten. No, the unconscious doesn't become formed and then choose words to speak. The unconscious, to Lacan, is constituted in the very process of language itself. Words are simply not the thing. That which you see in the mirror is no more you than your name. There's a distance between the tumultuous desires, the feelings, the emotions, and the words we attach to them. Our unconscious develops as our chain of language matures in complexities. Our unconscious behaves this way as well, structured and not bound and not desire. You see, to Lacan, is born of the interaction between the thing that is and the thing as we speak of it. But this isn't the bottom. This isn't closer. This just breaks down what Freud was doing. It has its own assumptions. In 1972, Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari would collaborate on what would become, in my opinion, maybe the most important book on the nature of desire itself and how it functions socially. Anti-Oedipus is almost as famous as Lacan for being impenetrable, but for this discussion, the first few lines are more than we need. It functions everywhere, sometimes without stopping, sometimes discontinuously. It breathes, it heats, it eats, it shits, it fucks. What a mistake to have ever said the it. Taking Lacan further than he had been willing to go, Deleuze and Guattari posit something radical. Desire is not simply within us. It is everywhere. It is everything. Not a flowing constant for us to fetishize. Far more. Desire produces us, not in one go, but instead desire is both the product of and producer of billions of tiny interactions producing something. A newborn is experiencing a shock to the system as every possible way of connecting the world happens, as all of the nerves produce a cacophony of stimuli. It screams, it gasps, it screams, it gasps, as stimuli beget stimuli, every muscle in its body firing. A nipple put in its mouth has a chance to be gasped in, and it is. New stimuli, new connections in mass for that newborn. Every interaction on every connection of this organism slowly becomes focused, specific, blocked out, as it is simply constant. Those blocked out happen. You can't smell your home, and every home smells funny to you, right? Now this infant, this newborn, multiple times a day for months and months and years, at first not connecting the satisfaction of the feeding, but then more and more, as mom hears crying and says, "Oh, you're hungry." Repeat this enough, and those intense experiences of desire become named, shaped, known, seeming like something like I am hungry. That newborn will come to learn a complex set of sensations is simply hunger. More will get folded into it. Sensations of calmness, security, warmth, love. But among the sensations remembered, all of these become grooves recorded in us, recorded in our memory, eroding canyons in places where desire once found itself freely connecting on a flat surface, now no longer. Now grooves, catches, hooks. Desire finds itself sorting. This sensation or not, this crevice or that, this memory or that. Is this hunger? These forces sort themselves out within us. And one day we find ourselves home after a rough day of work with an empty pack of Coca-Cola Oreos. Confused and self-hating. Of course we hate ourselves for doing that. We blame ourselves. We don't have the discipline. Why didn't I eat all these Oreos? But I forget the multitude of forces are at play. It's a multitude that if we could begin to understand it, we might be able to understand how we can find power there, how we can work with it, work with these passions, these desires, this will. But this is not how repression works. By collapsing all the forces into simplistic goals, wishes, wants, the name of the thing, we create the conditions for everything inside others to be seen that way as well. Soon I'll be telling people that they should have more self-control, that their weight is because they make bad choices. I make good choices. You reinforce it in them, and I reinforce it in myself. Once you've made this move, once you've stopped desire from freely connecting, all you can do is condemn the affirmative choices of others and live in a space of wishes and wants. Now let's talk about Seinfeld. Seinfeld was a show about nothing that gathered a whole bunch of sociopaths together that interacted and dealt with the codified social order and how they could break it. At the end of season 3 of the show, we've become well acquainted with the behaviors of every member of the group, especially Kramer, the frenetic neighbor, most famous for having no personal boundaries, busting into Jerry's apartment without the slightest invitation or notice.
Hey, Frank.
Now, this episode, titled The Keys, opens with this happening in the most extreme ways. Jerry gets home, needs the bathroom, finds Kramer in his tub. Jerry gets up in the middle of the night, only to find Kramer in the dark, taking food. Kramer isn't processing or cognizing desire into wants. He's simply allowing himself to experience desire directly. The end of the rope? This is when Jerry gets home. He wants to have sex on his own bed, only to find Kramer may have beaten him to it. In his frustration, Jerry demands his keys back.
All right, that's it. Hand them over.
What?
What? You know what? The keys. I want the keys. You've lost your key privileges.
Oh, come on.
No, come on.
Kramer had been given the responsibility of holding onto Jerry's spare set of house keys in case Jerry lost his own. Kramer clearly was abusing this responsibility, thus the title of the episode. And immediately, we see results. Not only does Kramer no longer burst through the door,
Who's there? Kramer.
he now knocks politely, even if the door is unlocked. Desire here, it's not acting, it's non-acting. He has self-control, knocking on the door, being nice and quiet. He's unable to simply act. He is not Kramer, he is broken. Here, Kramer changes. No longer the man who lives in the moment, simply does as he does. He begins talking for the first time about the future. He criticizes George for his lack of job, his lack of prospects, long-term relationships, all things Kramer not only doesn't have, but has never given a shit about.
Do you have a job?
No.
You got money?
No.
Do you have a woman?
No.
Do you have any prospects?
No.
You got anything on the horizon?
No.
The lines here are not about how he is experiencing a new type of want. It's that he's experiencing want at all.
George, it's time for us to grow up and be men. Not little boys.
Why?
You see, little boys simply do. Men are able to be measured, civilized, proper. They do the right thing. Now, nobody who was ever a fan of Seinfeld would speak of Kramer as wanting to push through a door or wanting to use Jerry's bathtub or bed.
I sense great vulnerability. A man-child crying out for love, an innocent orphan in the postmodern world.
I see a parasite. A sexually depraved miscreant who is seeking only to gratify his basest and most immediate urges.
It's a running joke that he's the id of the show. He simply does. He does not cognize his actions at all, but now he is. Now he's wanting, longing for something more, thinking over his life and the lacking reality he lives in. Everything to him now is the shape of something. It all seems like something else. That one moment he had on film, that's clearly what he was meant to do.
Ever since I was in that Woody Allen movie.
These pretzels are making me thirsty? That was one line. You got fired.
I know, but man, I never felt so alive.
Well, everything really at work between Jerry and Kramer has been crushed into this new simple thing. The keys. It's clear to everyone watching that there's more happening, and it's not just about the keys. It's even clear to the characters themselves, like Elaine, when she says under her breath,
You saw it, didn't you see it?
Yeah, I thought. I mean, it's complete bullshit.
the only way they could make this point stronger would be if Kramer spent an entire episode later selling a film treatment about a friend betraying another friend's trust about his keys and how awful this was. Maybe he'd even call the movie The Keys. I bet Fred Savage would be perfect for it. This play is something Seinfeld did a lot. Every episode was always about something. That thing that it seemed like it was about. The parking garage wasn't about a parking garage. It's the parking garage is the thing that it seems like. But it's actually about the odd complexity of parking garages and how they treat us socially in that space. The dog episode isn't about a dog. It's about the social complexities at play when you're stuck with an obligation that's dependent on you for its life. The subway isn't about the subway. It's about how absolutely insane the New York subway system is socially. This is what Seinfeld did and does. It laughs at tree stumps. Before I close out, I'm going to appeal to your complex desire mechanics, and I'm going to hope you got something out of this video. If you did, please give me a like. Subscribe. If you want to dive further into these things, please join us at Patreon at patreon.com/DGQC or on Discord. You can join our readings live at discord.gg/DGQC. I mean, I want to keep doing this. This is what I want. Want is not desire. So when you hear me or others on this channel talk about wants, we mean wants. When we talk about desire, we mean desire, passions, drives, force, not wants. After all, as Zizek himself says,
we don't really want what we think we desire.